In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Packleader build, which is a beginner druid build that focuses on using some werewolf skills as well as a lot of companion skills and is aimed at world tiers 1 and 2, and that can be used from the very beginning of the game till about levels 25 or 30 or so. The focus of this build is on using companion skills as well as dealing critical damage, and there are some good synergies between these two things, which I will show you in this video. So the general concept for this Diablo 4 Werewolf Druid build is two parts. First is using Shred to AoE down enemies quickly, and the second is using your companion skills to help wear down enemies. Companion skills, if you didn't know, don't consume any spirit, and Poison Creeper is one of the best AoEs druids have, if not one of the best AoEs in the game. And additionally, we will have a chance to refresh our companion skills via lucky hit, thanks to the Packleader Spirit Boon, and this will give you some serious firepower when this happens because, there's nothing like dropping a Poison Creeper and then 2 seconds later dropping another Poison Creeper. One of the things that adds to this build is Night Howler's Aspect, which boosts both your own and companions as well as nearby players' critical chance for 3 seconds after you use Blood Howl. This is fantastic. This makes you all deal more damage and is one of the reasons that I made this build because this skill plays a huge part in adding to the damage of all of you. Another aspect you can get, though it's kind of far but definitely worth the trip, is Shepherd's Aspect. This legendary aspect increases the damage of your core skills, which is Shred in this case, by a percentage based on how many companions you have out, which allows you to really boost your damage, and you get double the effect if this is on a two-handed weapon, which would not be a bad option. The synergies don't end there, however, as the Masochistic Spirit Boon heals you when you critically strike with shapeshifting skills, in this case Shred, and the Scythe Talons and Avian Wrath Spirit Boons boost your critical chance and critical damage. Make sure you bond to the Eagle Spirit in order to get both of these Spirit Boons. And finally, Stormclaw's Aspect makes you hit in an AoE for more damage when you critically hit with Shred, and the Aspect of the Unsatiated will boost subsequent Shred attacks when you kill enemies with Shred, which helps propel you further and further into a damage-dealing machine. Both of these aspects can be found in relatively early dungeons, so they are easy to get to. So let's talk a little bit about how we handle packs of enemies, and the general strategy for handling packs of enemies with this werewolf build is by using Shred to teleport into groups of enemies because it makes you jump forward, and then dropping Poison Creeper immediately afterwards if enemies are abundant. Obviously, you don't want to do this if there's just a few enemies. And then proceeding to drop Ravens onto the enemy group, AoEing them more, and then continuing to onslaught with Shred and Storm Strike as needed. Poison Creeper is just one of the best all-around Diablo 4 skills because of its high damage and the fact that it, immobilizes enemies in place for a time, which helps, prevent damage to yourself, which is great. And basically any druid build will probably use this skill. Make sure you upgrade this skill with the Brutal Poison Creeper upgrade as soon as you possibly can, because this will increase your critical chance against enemies that are strangled by this by 20%. That further adds to the critical chance that we have with this build, helping to get those much needed crits, which help fuel our damage. Moving along to Shred, this is the bread and butter skill of this build, and what's really great is that it hits 3 times in a row, and it deals more and more damage with each hit, and it has kind of a conal AoE, so you want to try and aim this into packs of enemies if possible. And because of the legendary aspects that I mentioned just a second ago, it deals a ton of damage, and then when you get your key passive later on in the game, Lupine Ferocity, this will have a guaranteed critical hit for massive damage, for increased critical damage every second use of it because of the amount of times that it strikes. And that's going to trigger that Stormclaw's Aspect every time as well, so that's going to give you even more damage, and that is a really good synergy with this build. You want to max this skill out, obviously, to get the most damage out of it, and this is where most of your damage is going to come from. You'll want Enhanced Shred and Raging Shred. Now, I take Raging Shred over Primal Shred, even though Primal technically has more synergy because it boosts the critical damage that you gain, and that would seem like the natural choice here. But what I like about Raging Shred is that it hits in a wider AoE, allowing me to hit more enemies more easily, and I find that poison is very valuable against bosses, and also setting poison on enemies allows you to use the Neurotoxin passive to set slowed on them, and then you can gain bonuses from, crowd control, damage versus crowd control, and damage versus slowed enemies to further boost your damage as well. And another thing I don't like about Primal Shred as well is that it gap closes on each of the 3 attacks, which can sometimes lag the game, it seems like, and also sometimes it teleports you past the target that you're trying to hit if you're not aiming precisely, particularly if you're using like a controller or something like that. And the regular version of the skill, anything non-Primal Shred, only teleports you on the first attack, so then that doesn't tend to happen to you. So moving along to the Ravens, these are going to just strike out and hit enemies regularly, and once you get the Enhanced Raven passive, when you trigger the active ability, which drops an AoE on the ground that hits over time, your critical chance is going to be increased by 5% when you attack enemies in there. So that further synergizes with this build because you need high crit to get crit damage and to trigger things like Stormclaw's Aspect. Moving along to Bloodhowl, we basically use this anytime it's off cooldown, and because we have the Night Howler's aspect, it's going to boost the critical damage of us and all of our companions every time we use this. And once you have the enhanced version of this, the cooldown is going to be reduced every time you kill an enemy, which will make you be able to use this really, really quickly. And this, of course, heals you. But the primary function of it, generally, is once you have the innate Bloodhowl passive, it will give you 20 spirit every time you use it. And this helps to keep your spirit up so you can keep using Shred. Druids in general just tear through their spirit when playing a Werewolf Shred build. So anything you can do to give you more spirit is better. So as long as you don't have maxed spirit, you'll want to use this every time it's off cooldown for that buff, whether you're at full health or not. The only exception to this is, of course, in boss fights where healing is more important than getting that spirit and that buff. So when you're in boss fights, you're just going to use this when you need the healing and then keep it the rest of the time. So talking a little bit about how we handle boss fights. So let's talk a little bit about Storm Strike. I haven't talked about this much yet, but Storm Strike is your basic attack. And the reason we use Storm Strike over Claw is a few reasons. First, Storm Strike hits multiple enemies where Claw does not, so that's very, very important. It also generates more spirit, which helps fuel Shred faster. And another really important point here is that Storm Strike is not a werewolf skill, and because we use the aspect of the Unsatiated to buff werewolf skills, after we kill something with Shred, if you used Claw after this buff triggers, then you would buff the damage of Claw, which is very low, and you would waste it. So by using Storm Strike, you can use Shred, alternate, use Storm Strike to set vulnerability on a target, and then go back and use Shred, and now the target's vulnerable, and then you get that extra damage with Shred. So making sure to not use Claw here actually benefits this build. And again, what we primarily use Storm Strike for, besides generating spirit, is to place vulnerability on targets. Once we have the Fierce Storm Strike upgrade, we have a 50% chance to apply vulnerable, and this comes in particularly handy in boss fights. So you use Shred, hit with Storm Strike, use Shred, hit with Storm Strike, etc. Just keep rotating like that, keep your spirit up, and keep vulnerable on the boss. And then lastly, when it comes to skills here, we use Wolves. Now, Wolves are much better in boss fights than they are on Trash, because they just don't deal a lot of damage passively, and their active skill targets one enemy. So this is best used on an elite or a boss. But they shine mostly in boss fights because they not only deal damage to that boss from a range, which is great because sometimes you can't stand up on a boss, but also because they tend to tank the boss, which takes pressure off you, allowing you to attack without getting hit by deadly boss attacks. And just a couple final tips before I wrap up this video. Bonuses you want to look for on gear, although I will say that you don't need to prioritize your bonuses on your gear while you're leveling. I spent a lot of time trying to do this, and let me tell you, it's frustrating because gear just constantly drops that's better and better as you're leveling. So don't worry about optimizing this at this point, but you do want to look for things like critical strike chance, critical strike damage, core skill damage, damage to crowd control enemies, and damage to slowed enemies. Those are the ones you really want to be on the lookout for because those are going to benefit your build the most. And I would say you want to use a two-handed weapon. You either want to use a staff, which will give you extra damage versus crowd controlled enemies, or you want to use like a double-handed axe, which will give you extra damage to healthy enemies, so when you use Shred, when you lead off with it, it'll deal increased damage. Remember that the Neurotoxin passive is extremely valuable for this build because it turns any poisons you do into slows, which allows you to gain that benefit from damage versus crowd-controlled enemies and damage versus slowed enemies. So make sure you put at least 1 point of Neurotoxin as soon as you're able to. And lastly, when you can get the Clarity passive, it really helps with this build because as you rotate back into human form from Werewolf, when you use Storm Strike, you'll gain 6 spirit when this happens. You don't gain it when you go into Werewolf form, but you get it when you come out into human form. So you use Shred, then Storm Strike, gain 6 spirit, use Shred, then Storm Strike, gain 6 spirit. And this helps increase your spirit gain significantly, allowing you to continue on with your shredding machine. That wraps up our Packleader Werewolf build. I hope you guys found this effective. I had a lot of blast playing this build. And I do want to mention one thing as well, is that World Tier 2 in this game seems to be kind of moot. You only gain extra experience and extra gold, and frankly, your clear speed will be faster on World Tier 1, which makes up for both of these things. There is no increased drop rate. So I would highly recommend just staying on World Tier 1 so that you can play through faster, and then once you get to World Tier 3, or you get to the point where you're ready to unlock World Tier 3, just hop over to World Tier 2, do the thing you need to unlock it, and then go to World Tier 3. So what did you guys think of the beginner werewolf build? Let me know in the comments below. Are you guys playing Druid? Are you loving Druid? I'm having a blast playing it. Let me know what you guys think.